you very much. And I do want to thank everyone who's been so good about sticking to the time. Dr. Gannon was kind enough to make a little fade the notice, and that's been very helpful. Our next speaker is a retired Air Force colonel who has a quarter of a century experience as an aerospace engineering officer with the Department of National Defense. He served for 4 years as the Director of Defense Ethics following the Somalia affair. Since his retirement in 2001, Paul Maillet, or Maillet, depending upon how you pronounce it, he informed me, he says Maillet. Paul has built and operates a successful consultancy focused on strengthening governance, organizational ethics, and corruption prevention. It works for Canadian federal government departments, Aboriginal communities, and international clients. Paul is also associated with the Civilian Peace Services Canada and involved in peace initiatives related to the relief of suffering and conflict reduction. So without further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Paul Maillet.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I would like to talk about is maybe the broader context of the Arab awakening. Margaret Wheatley once said, there's no force stronger for change in a community as when it discovers what it cares about. And I think what we see across a lot of these countries is people discovering what they care about. Certainly the youth demographics in the Middle East, where the average age is in the low 20s, issues of women's rights and issues of democratic reform. However, in that backdrop, revolutions or uprisings are very dangerous and often very, very predictable. We don't often get what we want out of them. Sometimes they go the way of the guillotine, for example, the French Revolution. Sometimes with social change and reform, it was the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. Sometimes religious theocracy emerges, the Iranian Revolution, the Khomeini regime. And sometimes dictators and oppression turn out. The Russian Revolution, for example, in the way of Stalin. And sometimes what it often takes is a counter-revolution in order to really get to where you want to get at. So in the aftermath of these revolutions and the revolutions that we're seeing now, when the dust settles, what remains? What do we have remaining here? Well, certainly in some of these countries like Libya, we have very heavily armed and angry populations. I think we have tribal factions that have arms now to the extent that they've never had before. Very, very, very dangerous. Who is organized to take over? Certainly not the youth who carried the burden of the revolution, but often either military factions, religious groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, military factions or political groups. When revolutions succeed, the day after, what's the first thing that usually happens? Well, sometimes these old feuds emerge, tribal interests, power and greed issues emerge, and sometimes the youth are marginalized as these things occur. Issues of solidarity may well recede. Idealism and youth are often replaced by powerful political and religious factions that are looking towards, their control of the government, power, the oil resources, the natural resources in the country. And often what's really happening here is the seeds of these counter-revolutions are being laid. If real democracy is not established at any point. So I think the caution is that we have to watch not to be just exchanging one oppressor for another oppressor as these things happen. So what is our response? What do we normally do? I think in Western society, or global society, we've got the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. We kind of balance these in some ways. Usually there's been waiting, there's a lot of paralysis going on, and more often than not, the military solution emerges. Following that, typically some sort of aid programs, but often, sometimes it's very well overlaid with very ill-advised and economic self-interest. We see in the United Nations yesterday the Friends of Libya, everybody lining up and almost ingratiating themselves to the current Libyan government. And I would ask, where are the friends of Sudan? Where are the friends of Yemen? Where are the friends of Syria?
Hey, fantastic.
This sort of attention. So if we do choose the ethic of justice, as we normally do, what happens? It's usually the laws of armed conflict are invoked. The ethic of justice, we judge them, we pronounce them guilty, we invoke the death penalty by sort of rote here, we wage war, people die, and the solution is more or less a military solution. the negotiated solution falls into the backdrop, which should result. And we all maybe understand just war theory and the right to go to war and just cause and legitimate authority, and certainly the right conduct of use of force during war, which we are supposed to protect non-combatants. They are not legitimate targets of military operations. So I think what we have now is the ethic of care, at least an opportunity, which I think is being sadly lost in some of these current conflicts. And we do need to codify things like these emerging doctrines of the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect doctrine and mandate that went into the Libyan operation was soon exceeded without a whole lot of discussion or debate or dialogue. And I think if we want to get into the ethic of care as a primary response to armed conflict in the international community, we've got to look at codifying that in a different way. And maybe as a result of the ethic of justice, where we start with military force, the ethic of care, we end with it. We end with the use of force. We start with stopping, preventing the violence and killing. That's the first thing. We care for the victims. We get into the negotiation, making spaces for negotiations and diplomacy, strengthening governance, rebuilding communities, economies and infrastructure, and finally getting around to reconciliation and justice at the end there. So by inverting that sort of thing and codifying that as a first response, then as a last resort, we could do other things. So perhaps the Libyan example has really set us back a little bit on this doctrine. And this begs the question, is that if it worked in this context and we set this precedent, how are we going to get cooperation of the Arab League and whatever, when we now want to try to help the populations in Yemen, in Syria, and these other uprisings? I mean, we may well not have seen the worst as this Arab uprising goes along in this decade, if it marches into Saudi Arabia and into Iran. And I think we have to have this response right at some point. So I think in terms of responsible assistance, when we are looking at helping people in countries, either in conflict or post-conflict situations, probably revolves around three questions. You know, what is the need? And it's to ask them, what do you need? What can you do for yourselves, and what help do you need from others? I think the engagement has to be that fundamentally at that level. But I think whatever we do, we don't want to lose sight of the issues of human rights, nonviolence and peace. And I think this movement is massive, and no country in the Middle East will be exempt. And I often don't think we will recognize the Middle East by the end of this decade. So I would just leave you with a little quote. If we can't do something, then we should say something. If we can't say something, then we should feel something. But something has to be done in this particular context. Thank you very much.